Great, and welcome everybody. My name is Jamie Lee, and I'm Associate Professor at the School of Information here at the University of Arizona. And I'm so pleased to welcome Professor Miriam Sweeney from the University of Alabama, who's here to present today. So thank you for agreeing to join us. And Dr. Miriam Sweeney is an Associate Professor of Library and Information Studies at the University of Alabama. She studies the design, use, and meaning of technology in society. Dr. Sweeney's research has predominantly focused on anthropomorphic interface design, chatbots, digital assistants, also voice interfaces, artificial intelligence, and big data infrastructures, with attention to issues of value in design, privacy, and ethics. Her current research examines issues of privacy, autonomy, and surveillance in voice assistant services, raising questions about how voice assistant design and infrastructure might better account for data privacy, user autonomy, and consumer protections. And we have the chat here. If you have questions along the way, just put them in and I'll address them once we wrap up with Miriam's talk. So join me in welcoming Miriam Sweeney. So thank you for coming.
Well, hi, thanks so much. It always takes a moment to get all settled here, so I appreciate that. And I see some faces that are familiar in the crowd. So hello, hi, Zach. Hope you're doing well out there. Yeah, thank you for the kind introduction and the warm welcome. And in particular, I do want to extend a thanks for the students and the faculty who invited me and thought of me to come and speak with you all today. Again, having these virtual options to kind of jump in and share is really cool. Sorry that I can't be there in person, but it is really wonderful to connect in this way. So to start off, I want to give a general overview of the kind of research that I conduct and how I approach critical information and technology studies. Let me get the slide advancing technology together. Okay, great. So as Dr. Lee mentioned, I am a critical digital media and information scholar who studies anthropomorphic design. And I'll say that saying anthropomorphic over and over again is a real skill that you have to master. And at this point, I finally can do it without tripping up every time. I also study virtual assistants, voice interfaces, and AI. Specifically interested in applying lenses of gender, race, and sexuality, among other kinds of critical lenses as well. So often my projects explore linkages between identity, design, data valence throughout these technologies, kind of linking back up to the bigger infrastructures that Dr. Lee mentioned. And the images on this slide depict some of my previous research on digital assistants. For example, if we kind of work clockwise around the diagram, Microsoft's sexy search engine, Ms. Dewey, which was a viral marketing campaign of Microsoft circa 2006. If you're not familiar, there's still footage up on YouTube, and so you can Google it after the talk. The one to the next of that is the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services Digital Assistant, Emma, which is really presented as kind of an ideal citizen walking you through citizen processes. And that project was a collaboration with Dr. Melissa Nicholas at the University of Rhode Island. On the bottom is the AVA airport worker holograms used by various airlines and also TSA, another collaboration with Dr. Nicholas. And then finally, the smart home devices that you are likely familiar with, things like Alexa for Amazon's Echo speaker and the sort of suite of technologies with that. So at the core, these technologies have a lot in common with how they process information and provide assistive experiences for folks. However, as you can tell, they range in design and presentation in other interesting ways that raises questions to me as a researcher about how these designs might be imagined to connect with particular users in particular use scenarios. So I am interested in the ways that gender and race are strategically leveraged as design features of these technologies, how that shapes the interpretation and the meaning of these technologies, and how this increases the buy-in for these technologies that are often invasive in a kind of a surveillance way by collecting a lot of personal and intimate data about us in our environment, in our home networks, right, in our most intimate spaces. And that brings us to the topic of today's talk, caring as surveillance. So I came across this new Amazon Alexa service, Alexa Together, recently, and it's described as a new way to provide support for your loved ones, keeping you together even when you're apart. And it's really sold as this caregiving service, and it requires a subscription and then also having an Amazon Echo device to facilitate the remote support of elderly family members, including control of household devices and increased surveillance opportunities in sort of the ecosystem of devices. Alexa Together is one prominent example of what I've observed as an emerging targeted marketing landscape of voice assistants as assistive devices and remote aids for specifically elderly people and also disabled people. And of course, those may be overlapping categories, they also may not be. Using this example, I want to spend some time in this talk talking about caring as a discursive framework that creates targeted opportunities for data extraction in the home, with elderly and disabled folks being kind of situated at the forefront of this surveillance through these kinds of opportunities. Okay, so let's start with some basics about AI voice assistants and data gathering to kind of situate this. So artificially intelligent digital assistants, so AI digital assistants, like Amazon Alexa, act as voice-based interfaces to a variety of services, applications, and information using personalized conversational interaction with users. And I'm guessing that many of you listening are not only familiar with these products, but might enthusiastically use these products in a day-to-day scenario. So that's great. I think they're very popular, and we'll see how you feel about that at the end of the talk. But voice assistants are often utilized via smart speakers, things like Amazon Echo or Google Home, but also might be accessed through mobile devices or search interfaces and third-party applications or other Internet of Things technologies. So there's kind of a whole range of entry points into this. In the United States, voice assistant use has been steadily growing over the last decade. Edison research found that smart speaker adoption increased during the pandemic, with about 94 million people in the US estimated to own at least one smart speaker in 2021, which was up from 76 million in 2020. So that's a huge jump in just 1 year. Additionally, 24% of Americans own an Amazon Echo device specifically, reflecting Amazon's dominance in the smart speaker market at about 53% of the market share. And that's true globally as well. And that makes Amazon, an interesting case study, an important site for study, since they really are kind of an industry leader in this area. Adding to this landscape, market research indicates that providing a simplified and unified user experience that enables all the devices to work together in the home instead of having just a collection of standalone devices is really kind of the overall goal for smart home platforms and where these technologies are headed in the future. So key platforms that might be integrated into this home environment are things like Alarm.com, Comcast Xfinity, and Vivint, voice-based platforms like Amazon Alexa, Google Assistant, Apple Siri, and then home control platforms like Samsung SmartThings or Nest and Apple HomeKit. So all of these things can work together with the voice assistant being that central point of contact. And further market research shows that smart device owners are more likely to use smart speakers with voice assistants to control devices in their home. In the past few years, smart speakers have emerged as the default point of interaction in the smart home. So this is kind of, the killer app that's emerging in this market. So these developments are important for us to watch as infrastructures for systems become integrated across corporate and governmental entities. And that includes law enforcement, for instance, the relationships between, Ring and such, and law enforcement, are one side of that. Military uses, immigration, healthcare, credit systems. We have these kind of systems of governance or of governance that become linked together to home governance specifically. And so that's an important connection that I'm also exploring throughout this research. And then technically speaking, if we kind of look under the hood of these technologies, then AI voice assistants use a suite of technologies, including advanced artificial intelligence, automatic speech recognition, natural language processing, text-to-speech, and machine learning to extract and process data from conversational inquiries to meet users' informational, consumer, and recreational needs, and also to interact with a bevy of other smart home devices, to control those in the home. So the way this works is voice assistants rely on people's current and historical data profiles. So things like purchases you've made, your location, public records available, demographics, preferences that you've set in different systems, biometrics of different kinds, and other existing information profiles. And all of that comes together to create data models to answer complex questions, make recommendations, and offer predictions to anticipate future needs and uses. And none of these developments would have been possible without the growth of, cost-effective and scaled-up computing infrastructures, things like cloud computing, server storage, and data processing to handle the compiling and mining of massive data sets. So in this sense, we can say that big data is both the driver of the development of voice technologies, as well as the foundation of the consumer business model that they support. And in fact, it's kind of an Ouroboros of effects where they sort of feeds each other, building as it goes, right? Trying to create the source of data that becomes, the raw material that these new technologies can be optimized on. So based on all of this information, I think it's fair to say that data extraction, not user services, is really the critical function of voice assistants and related smart technologies, and that it's people's data that's the prized commodity driving the push for integrative smart technologies, not just concerns for how you might most efficiently navigate and use your home. That there's this other side to it, right? And the home becomes instead a site for data collection, and efficiency and better ways to navigate our home become the product that we're sold, even though the real product underneath is our data. So there's a term for this, surveillance capitalism. A lot of you might be familiar with Shoshana Zuboff's popular and excellent book. So surveillance capitalism is a term for the economic process of capturing and commodifying personal data for profit. And that is known as surveillance capitalism. And of course, Zuboff treats this in depth in her book, and there's many other kinds of writing about this as well. So quantification of behavior is a really important element of this, and really is sort of at the heart of data capture and voice assistance. So Zuboff describes the extraction imperative as the first economic imperative of surveillance capitalism, wherein raw materials and their supplies must be produced at an ever expanding scale. And the raw materials in question that we're talking about here are user data, which are transformed into commodities with market value. So basically, in turn, these become behavioral predictions products, which are sold in a new type of market called the behavioral futures market. So in the context of an increasingly algorithmically driven society, human experiences and activities and affect and social relationships are translated into this reserve of behavioral data controlled by technology companies like Amazon that design products for surveillance and data capture. And so, if you think about like the way you move about your house and the interactions you have, you might need to solve a problem, in terms of figuring out what the weather is going to be, what temperature, to set your home system to, finding information out and turning off and on lights and all these things. And without sort of this layer on top of it, those become just sort of behaviors and relations in the household. But with this layer on top of it, those become important sites of sort of commodifiable data that we can use to optimize and predict how to better and more efficiently do and process those behaviors in the future. So there's kind of a transference where behaviors and affects and relationships become brought into this commodified marketplace through the capture of this data. These companies are the primary brokers of behavioral data, the big five and all this, and exert enormous political and economic control in all aspects of the big data landscape, from data capture, storage, processes, and services. So big tech companies that make voice assistants actually hold enormous political power to shore up their market dominance and autonomy. So the public advocacy group Public Citizen reported that Facebook and Amazon are now the two largest individual corporate lobbyists in Washington, with their political spending eclipsing that of telecommunications and arms companies in 2020. So that's huge, right? That really shows the kind of political influence that these companies have. And altogether, it really paints us a picture of a digital corporatocracy of sorts, shaped by extreme power asymmetries in favor of the corporate ownership and control of people's intimate data. And I emphasize this as a critical point for understanding the drivers behind the voice assistant market and the value of focusing on people's intimate data as a valuable raw resource. As we consider the move to specifically target elderly folks or disabled folks in the home as part of the consumer expansion of getting new markets and new data, then it raises questions about the ways that this data circulates in these behavioral predictions markets, and also what unforeseen consequences that might have. What about harm? How do folks fit into that, right? Okay. So that was just kind of a primer and a background, but now I do want to turn to the context of the home, since voice assistants have been heavily marketed as domestic technologies. And I want to just insert a caveat there to say that there is a much longer history of domestic technologies to insert here and how they relate to gender and race and class and all sorts of things. But for the sake of time and the scope of this talk, I'm going to sort of move forward to the current moment, but I'm happy to address questions to that in the Q&A. So this is all an important context that sets up the conditions for voice assistants as ideal carers or caregivers for elders through services like Alexa Together. And now let's consider how some of the marketing of Amazon Alexa as the ideal caretaker in the home is discursively mobilized to equate caring with connecting or caring with surveilling. So Amazon's advertising and marketing campaigns have heavily emphasized homemaking and caretaking traits as central affordances of the Alexa digital assistant since its launch. A lot has been written on this. I highly recommend both Heather Wood's work and also Tao Fan's work, which I have cited here, Amazon Echo and the Aesthetics of Whiteness. These are great pieces that fill in some of those gaps. So for example, one of the first advertisements, which is featured here, features vignettes of Alexa assisting with numerous feminine coded household tasks, including pulling up recipes while cooking, compiling grocery lists, answering homework questions after school, teaching kids proper etiquette, and reading children to sleep in bed with an audiobook. So in these scenes, Alexa is explicitly positioned as a member of the household, but positioned in feminized caretaking roles. So Alexa is alternatively cast as a wife, a mother, a nanny, a domestic servant, a secretary, or a girlfriend, which Wood argues transforms Alexa into, quote, a whole person caretaker. And as a child in the advertisement explains about Alexa and the Echo smart speaker device it runs on, the child says, it's really become a part of the family, right? So this sort of domestic setting is really heavily emphasized. And again, there's a lot of really excellent scholarship kind of detailing and exploring some of these different roles in terms of secretary, girlfriend, servant, all of these things. Wood notes, one way that technological advances are rhetorically negotiated is by threading sort of staple components of the past into the present. So AI technologies such as smart security systems, robot vacuum cleaners, smart thermostats, Internet of Things, they all extend this trajectory of kind of the history of domestic technologies, of home management, moving the home from what was previously innovated was the automated environment to now an autonomous environment that enacts domesticity and domestic care in new formations. Wood aptly describes this as digital domesticity, wherein, quote, the technologies themselves become responsible for homemaking and caretaking, simultaneously re-articulating femininity and domesticity in the process. Strangers and Kennedy have a wonderful book called The Smart Wife, which kind of goes in depth into these kinds of domestic technologies and issues of gender. And they describe smart home technologies like AI digital assistants as, again, smart wives, using wife as a shorthand and a metaphor for a specific form of gendered labor that takes place within particularly heterosexual marriage institutions, carrying forward ideologies and expectations of domesticity into modern homemaking. So digital domesticity as a framework is helpful here for understanding how caretaking roles become sort of ideally outsourced to voice assistants in the home, despite the increased surveillance that they demand. As feminist care ethics scholars like Joan Tronto remind us, examining care work always necessitates accounting for the politics and the power dynamics that shape which bodies are providing care labor, who is receiving care, and where exploitation or abuse might occur in that process. These questions gain new salience in the data environment of the smart home with the smart life, where the trade-off for receiving care may be the relinquishing of personal privacy and ceding access and control of intimate data to corporations and the state. So those are some things that we can hold and think on. To get to elderly folks specifically, depictions of disabled, elderly, and non-independent adults were not initially represented in these advertisements from Amazon. It's really interesting. There's really a focus on, sort of the middle or upper class kind of affluent heterosexual home with 2.5 kids and I assume a picket fence in the back. I'm not sure. But while parent-child caregiving has been central to the advertising of Alexa from the beginning, new services like Alexa Together focus on opportunities for supporting the caregiving of elderly family members. So this is sort of a new tactic, a new angle. Thus, the introduction of services like Alexa Together and also ones like Alexa Kids, and that's kind of the other end of this, surveilling the very young, represent a new strategy of expansion through market segmentation to specify age and ability demographics within the household that are being particularly targeted. Further, elderly and disabled folks may have been historically overlooked and ignored in the design of smart technologies. To date, the majority of AI digital assistant research has focused on use by able-bodied people and fails to account for the participants' actual motor, linguistic, and cognitive abilities. And given this, there are tremendous opportunities to rethink domestic smart technologies and consider the potentials for voice interfaces and other AI voice assistants as assistive devices. Emerging research in this area has focused on the usefulness of voice assistants, for instance, to assist physically disabled people and also to older adults with low technology use or proficiency. And so that's an important area of expansion to think about. Of course, for all of those potentials and possibilities, voice assistant technologies have a way to go before being truly considered inclusive. And there are many still problematic examples of things like cultural language bias in voice technologies. Research points to usability issues related to the syntax of voice commands and difficulties of pronunciation. And there are a number of speech recognition problems. I have on here, the slide is just a clip of that SNL skit about imagining Amazon Echo designed for the elderly. I don't know if you've seen it. It's very dumb in the very best ways, but it kind of reveals, sort of a breakdown with elderly users trying to speak to and even understand what's going on with Alexa. So it's funny, but also I think, as with humor, there's always, a point of truth in there. However, beyond the technical and cultural challenges that need to be addressed for improving usability of AI digital assistants for accessibility, inclusive design must also grapple with power dynamics, inequalities, and vulnerabilities that these technologies enable and may reproduce through the processes of surveillance, data extraction, and data sharing. So a closer look at Alexa Together might help us raise some of these issues, identify some of these issues, and consider where privacy breaches and data harms may occur. Okay, let's take a look a bit closer at Alexa Together. So described as, and this is a screenshot of their advertisement for it, described as a caregiving service that connects your Alexa app to their Echo devices. Alexa Together emphasizes connection as a function of care in the advertising descriptions, blending both the social and the computational meanings of the term. So the social meaning of connection, we might think of referring to, the affective ties and social obligations shared between people, right? The relational part. The computational meaning of connection, though, suggests the tethering of digital devices to the internet to send and receive information. And also the blending of these meanings is key to not only framing Amazon's marketing of Alexa as a digital caregiver, but also for cementing the idea of data extraction as an integral part of modern social and therefore informational infrastructure. Informational infrastructure is thus both technical and material and cultural and ideological in nature, right? It's all those things wound together. So as an example, we have cultural ideas about who performs caretaking for elderly and disabled family members and where caretaking ideally takes place. And those are juxtaposed by the realities and the constraints of modern living. For instance, multi-generational household dwelling is often not the norm in the United States for white middle-class families for a variety of reasons. People may not live geographically near their families, also for a variety of reasons, with availability of economic opportunities being one of those. And at the same time, healthcare, at least in the United States, is privatized, tied to employment, and otherwise may be expensive to the point of exclusion for folks. So meanwhile, social services to support independent living and care assistance for elderly and disabled people has been critically defunded and deinvested in for decades. So the promise of caregiving through Alexa Together ostensibly resolves these structural conflicts by offering individualized technological solutions for caregiving that essentially reinvest in the private companies that have actually been the ones displacing public social services, kind of going back to sort of the power asymmetries and the complex political economy of interests there. Alexa Together repackages previously available features and applications of Alexa, so things like setting up customized alerts, with new services like 24/7 urgent response, what they call a circle of support, and remote assistance that extend the ability for family members, friends, and health services to monitor and communicate with their loved ones from a distance. The customized activity alerts for Alexa provide a real-time feed of, quote, what your loved one is doing with just a quick look at your phone. And Amazon's website advertises this feature, quote, keeps you in the loop and keeps them independent. So for remote assist, the family member can use their phone for things like setting up reminders, managing shopping lists, and also managing different settings for their Echo devices. And it even permits for you to, quote, drop in on the loved one by initiating a call. In a case a family member is not available because, quote, life can get in the way, according to Amazon's marketing, that circle of support feature can allow other people in the family and friends network the ability to check in on the loved one. And there's lots of interesting, the marketing material has a lot of like demo YouTube videos where, you have like an elderly family member and her son who is like dropping in, and he's concerned like, Mom, where are you? What are you doing? And she's like, I'm just painting, and he's like, oh, okay, So it's like, it's interesting to kind of show that even in their marketing videos, they sort of show that maybe there are some tensions, right, around the drop-in feature. Okay, so you might be thinking, well, some of this isn't new, if you grew up when I did, then you're used to the like, I've fallen and I can't get up commercials. And so that is certainly part of this technological trajectory as well. So whereas a phone call might enable a similar kind of connection with family members, Alexa Together offers an informational level of surveillance of the elder person. So for instance, receiving reports on the use of the Alexa device, for instance, is kind of a different and informational level of specificity, right? So though home medical assistant technologies aren't new, the movement from an accessible telecommunication access point to an informationalized surveillance apparatus actually does mark an important change in the role and function of these technologies. The care strategies for elder family members has shifted from a paradigm of kind of independent living that is facilitated by giving the elder person the ability to access medical services at point of need at time of emergency, to transferring the control to external family members who can kind of virtually drop in on or monitor their loved ones' datafied routines without them even being aware, right? Like, so, a family member can be checking and seeing how someone is using their device and what they're doing, and that may not be something that the elder person is aware of. This extension of home medical devices from that one-way communication device to a surveillance informational device that depend on the collection of user data follows the trajectory of algorithmic culture writ large, that kind of reduces people to their data profiles and is valued for the perceived objectivity and predictive value that it offers. So AI voice assistants provide the mechanism for data extraction to facilitate those goals, and in the process, expose the elder or disabled person to heightened forms of surveillance in the home. While Amazon claims that they are not in the business of selling your personal data and information to others, they do in fact share data amongst their own companies and third parties. And that's a little loophole for how they think about that. But the data captured through the Alexa Together service is tied into third-party services that Amazon is partnering with that extend into public and health services. So for instance, Alexa Together is connected to a 24/7 urgent response line that can be accessed via a voice request saying, Alexa, call for help. This feature connects the caller to trained agents who can request the dispatch of emergency responders such as police, fire department, or ambulance on your behalf. In the FAQs, they explain that this is a private service, that Alexa communication does not actually feed into and support 911, which is a public emergency communication service, and cannot directly dispatch emergency services. Instead, the dispatcher can only request help from relevant agencies like police, fire, emergency. In other words, they've set up kind of a privatized intermediary, infrastructural intermediary that functions like between the person in need and these public services that we have invested in. So it's an interesting way of creating kind of another corporate layer, another kind of extractive layer in between a public service, right, that someone could otherwise access. Data harms, okay, if we're thinking about these, and those are just kind of a vignette of some of the things that Alexa Together does, but we'll say Amazon asserts that as Alexa Together becomes more advanced, you'll be able to do even more, nodding to this culture of capital expansion and progress that undergirds the continued development of the technologies to continually do more, right? Which usually indicates the parallel expansion into new forms and markets of data collection. Doing more also often means like more levels of surveillance, new ways to kind of to capture data. How this impacts people, I mean, elderly and disabled people are already socially excluded in ways that structurally diminish or sometimes fully deny their own autonomy, agency, and authority. While there are existing models of elder care that raise similar kinds of power imbalances, including retirement institutions and medical alert technologies, I mean, this is a full, deeper conversation. AI digital assistants potentially add new layers of harm at the data surveillance level, heightened by their integrations with external applications and services. So if data is the real commodity, as we mentioned earlier, driving the expansion of these devices, then we have to also consider what the true cost that our elderly family members and we also by an extension may pay in terms of privacy, dignity, safety, and autonomy in return for care, right? In return for basic care. Data harms is a term I'm using, and data harms defined by Joanna Redden, Jessica Brand, and Vanessa Terzivia are the adverse effects caused by uses of data that might impair, injure, or set back a person, entity, or society's interests. Data harms include, but are not limited to, outcomes that violate privacy, reproduce social inequities, such as racist stereotypes, such as Safiya Noble's book on the screen here, contribute to discriminatory hiring practice, such as those detailed by Kathy O'Neill, put people into increased contact with law enforcement or carceral systems, see Ruha Benjamin's work, or interfere with people's access to social services. Eubank's work is a wonderful primer on that. And there are other books up here that, if you're interested in thinking about the various kinds of data harms, I would very much recommend. So while data harms have important implications for everyone, for all people, people who are part of communities that have been historically oppressed, marginalized, or otherwise socially excluded disproportionately experience data harms and with more severe outcomes. The irony, of course, is that as surveillance and algorithmic governance intensifies for the public at large, there remains a dearth of accountability, transparency, and regulatory structures for these companies that are responsible for collecting and using this data. And of course, a reminder also that if these companies are also bigger lobbyists than the arms companies, right, and telecoms, then we can also see a direct linkage there on why regulatory processes are so remain out of reach. The public is largely unaware of or unable to intervene on how their personal data circulates through these systems, but it holds great influence over all aspects of their lives, including banking, credit, housing, education, healthcare, policing, citizenship, information sharing, social networking, insurance, criminal justice, all of the major areas, right, that we might want to name. In all of these scenarios, people may experience data-based harms or be subject to algorithmic governance in ways they cannot fully see or trace. So the focus on surveilling family members in the home due to their age and ability status creates an abundance of targeted data on populations that are often already hyper-surveilled in society. And again, I'm drawing on Eubanks's work here as she's considering this for folks who are seeking social support and services needs. This ends up reproducing normative values about who is seen as deserving of bodily autonomy and independence and who is not. We're not all equally represented in the data streams that make up the reserves of big data. As in the over-policing of poor and minority neighborhoods, hypervisibility often leads to disproportionate chance of being incorporated into institutions and systems of state control, including policing, hospitals, and asylums. Whoops. And similarly, we might say that elderly and disabled people are at that front line of digital home surveillance, raising questions about what it means to be incorporated into the big data networks that are increasingly shared between corporate and state institutions. Data harms in this context might violate personal privacy in ways that create unwanted or non-consented exposure to medical institutions, insurance companies, Medicaid, Social Security, and other financial benefits. So for instance, voice is a very powerful biometric technology. Health data amassed from AI digital assistants can be used to track patterns of speech and assign diagnoses like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, stroke. I have a news article here that was from 2022, but it was sort of about a bunch of hospitals and academic institutions getting these grants to kind of, further optimize these technologies around being able to diagnose through voice. And so, I mean, this is, when you think about, and they mention in here too, that in this landscape, they've been held back by developing this because they haven't had as much access to huge data sets. Well, guess what? We have the voice assistants gathering, a huge amount of voice data now. And so that enables, right, this kind of work to be done. So care outsourced to AI digital assistants might result in a reduction of human interaction and also increase loneliness in elder adults. There are some studies that have looked at that. Altogether, there's a lot of questions, though, that remain about the particular ways that data from AI digital assistants is circulated and networked into social services, governance, and city planning, and how this might impact elderly and disabled people specifically. And further, as I'm kind of wrapping up, further the neoliberal context of deregulation and privatization that has enabled big tech companies like the Big Five to thrive, right? And consolidate their market power and become this, vital piece of information infrastructure are some of the same political forces that have actively weakened social services and health access and affordable housing and, financial safety nets for everyday people. And those things very much impact the elderly and how they're able to access care and help at end of life, right? In this landscape, elder care and support for disabled people has become more expensive, more tenuous, and less accessible to those who require it more than ever. So Alexa together offers, a technological solution to caregiving that obscures the fact that people are struggling to meet care labor needs because the state has actively divested in the social, political, and financial systems that would otherwise ensure care work be accessible, sustainable, and equitable to the citizenry. Final thoughts, or staying focused on the right things. Alexa Together offers just one vantage point from which we might explore issues of surveillance and AI voice assistance in the home within processes of algorithmic culture and governance. While there are certainly many conveniences associated with these technologies, it's also critical to not lose sight that the fact that voice assistants function as powerful sites of data extraction within this vast apparatus of corporate and governmental data networks and political entities. And it's in this framework that we really need to situate voice assistants and their development as surveillance devices and manifestations of algorithmic culture, considering the larger political economic factors that these infrastructures rely on at their core, which is really in ever increasing levels of surveillance and data extraction that make people's intimate routines legible to private and public institutions as a kind of raw resource, a raw data resource. While elder adults may be at the forefront of surveillance in the home as a function of care, we should all take note that the development of these technologies and the scope of their predictive uses will likely be applied to all of us. And I will end my talk there for now.
All right, thank you, Miriam.
You are welcome.
So I would actually like to kick off just a little question about
I'll stop sharing.
The work that you've done historically around literacies and how that might center in what you're doing now with voice assistants. And if you had any sort of advice for doctoral students who are interested in AI too, to how to think about also looking at literacies and the importance of literacies in this work.
Yeah, certainly. So if we're thinking in terms of sort of algorithmic literacies, perhaps specifically, I think, really understanding this literature around data harm and, considering the political and economic landscape of these technologies beyond sort of just the technical landscape is a really big part of that. Because often I think we're focused on, well, I think not just we, but I think often, there's such a drive to just kind of accept that these technologies are part of some kind of natural progress that is sort of inevitable and happening in society. And then we can just, and that really restricts our questions to then, oh, well, then how can we use that? How can we apply it? How can we optimize it? How can that be more efficient? How can we just reduce the bias and keep moving or what have you? But it doesn't let us kind of, question more fundamental assumptions that we might have about these technologies in terms of, who is really the beneficiaries of these, who is driving and setting the agendas, how is that linked into a bigger, political framework, and really who is harmed on the other end disproportionately. So I think that widening that scope is part of a literacy set that is really important.
Thank you. That was so helpful. Does anybody have a question for Miriam?
I'll ask a question. Hey,
yeah,
hey, Miriam.
sure. Hi.
Hey,
Hi.
great to see you, and thanks for a great
too.
talk. Yeah, I'm just curious, it's kind of a chilling vision of the future, right? That you're painting for us. We're all going to be surveilled in our spaces, and what do you think will make people kind of start to push back against these data harms, the digital harms that are happening? Are there harms that might become so visible that people have to react to them, or what do you see this going? Is there a way people can resist?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I really see this as this has become a structural problem, and in the same way that other structural problems, we can talk about our individual responsibility. I think we do have to examine why these tech companies have been given sort of free rein to decide all of our futures for us. And that is a field of politics and political action, really. And so it's not as simple as using or not using these technologies. In many ways, these technologies are becoming built in so that you at times are not able to opt out of that, and so that is part of the harm environment. But it also means that the focus point should not necessarily be on, we can talk about consumer power and non-adoption, and I'm for that. We can work on multiple fronts as well. But really, the issue is a political issue. There's a regulatory landscape. Why are these companies allowed to? I think ChatGPT and all of that coming out right now is part of this conversation too. It's who are the people setting this vision of our future? And we're not all in on it, but it impacts us more than them, and it impacts a certain sections of society, even more, right? So I think my answer to that is understanding that these are political issues, not technical issues, really, and that it's kind of part of a larger political conversation about the environment and our agenda, our bigger global agendas around what this is. So I think political activism, being involved in that, is a wonderful space for folks to be involved. There are labor concerns in this as well that connect up to other kinds of labor rights and other kinds of social movement rights. And there is a tremendous ability, I think, to connect at that level and try to push back as a group, right? So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for this great presentation. It's nice to see that privacy considerations are being addressed from different social groups and different ages, because we always tend to think that we need to protect our privacy when we are adults or sometimes children. But it's the first time that I listened someone talking about protecting privacy for all people. And I think we all are going to be there at some point. So it's, as Zach said, it's interesting to consider the future. So my question has to do with the, I'm curious if in your research, have you noticed or you can talk more about differences, cultural differences in terms of how those adults approach the use of technology, or how do you make some distinctions either in terms of culture or in terms of digital literacy when they are, living with those AI-assisted technologies?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so I'm going to start with kind of a caveat and disappointing answer that that's not part of my research, but there is research on this. And so there are there's a lot of studies, especially that come out of kind of like the marketing advertising kind of landscape, because consumer marketing, there's very interested in sort of how people are engaging with and using these technologies. And the other space is, of course, like kind of an HCI area as well. And so there are a lot of studies about like how do people like understand and accept these technologies, like how are now in terms of cultural differences, I don't know that literature as well to say what what cultural differences there are that exist and what has been studied on that. But I do know that folks are kind of interested in understanding things like trust, like do people trust these devices, and like under what circumstances do they find them jarring, or is it like it's totally fine? What do they think they do? And these studies are also done with children as well, because again, the other side of this is sort of like an intense marketing towards children, and like the Alexa Kids suite and stuff, which provides like a lot of access. And we have like consumer protections for kids in other areas, like you can't market to kids in particular ways, but like with these devices, it's like kind of a free-for-all, and so there's interest in how to reach children through this, and also how kids understand and trust this. Like, hey, when you talk to that, do you understand what it is, and is it different than talking to your stuffed animal, or like that kind of thing? So this is to say, I don't really know that research, but there is an extensive body of that out there if it's something that you want to follow up on. So thank you for asking. I'm sorry, I did not know the answer.
Oh, thank you so much for your answer.
Sure.
One thing that really struck me is just thinking about the whole capitalist, I guess the centrality, but then even thinking of the behavioral futures market and thinking about the data that is tracked that then becomes this pool in a marketplace that we have no control over. And our youngest daughter is like, oh my God, you should get those smart light bulbs and set up your home and all this. And we're just like, oh my God, we can barely do our smart TV. They got us the smart TV. And it's like, oh, just thinking that is probably also tracking us whenever we speak into our remote. And I don't know, it's just all of these things that you don't realize somehow it's being connected and tracked. And so I see you have a book contract and you're working on this book.
I do.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Are you writing the book right now, or is it already in press?
No, I'm still working on it. So absolutely. So this kind of work will be a part of that. I'll be looking kind of at sort of an expansive look at voice technology, including kind of voice technology, early, what was sort of the trajectory of that development and the way that it was really, funded by government agencies, and kind of the material resources that go into setting up this infrastructure. I'll be looking at, incorporating some of the things from my earlier work around, again, sort of that digital domesticity piece, and, tracking those developments around, why are some personality, why do we have the design of these feminine personas, and how does that relate to kind of these other histories of digital or of domestic technology use? I'll be thinking about the stuff I talked about today. And also in terms of, looking at how this stuff gets integrated in public spaces, because, there's been a real focus on things like voice assistants in the home, but now, this technology is going to be everywhere, and it creates interesting, those are different use scenarios, because putting something in someone's home where you have kind of a finite group of main users, who then if you're doing market profiling of them, it's kind of within this bounded context. But when these things go out into more public spaces, then it's doing something different. And so what are some of the differences? Like, I know that some like police cars and stuff have like voice assistant interfaces for their interfaces and things, right? So, like there's just like interesting new use cases for that. And something that Dr. Vivian Nicholas and I have looked at as well is, the use of these type of programs in government agencies, like the citizenship, I can't say it today, chatbot and things like that. So it'll kind of go forward. And I will look at areas of, to Zach's question, like resistance and like how folks are approaching resistance efforts, and what does it mean to sort of not buy into the system, and what does that look like? So there will be some of these different elements in that. Thank you for asking. I'm excited to end this semester and refocus on that.
Anybody else have any questions? One thing that we had like read about an article where the students returning to like elementary school after COVID, like would call out like Mrs. Rasmussen, like loudly, like how their parents did at home to Alexa. So I was just kind of, thinking about these embodied ways we hear and understand, but we don't know the implications of this. Let's see, did someone post a question?
Yeah, I see the question in the chat. Okay, wait, so hold on. Just to what you just said, though, I think something that is interesting is that some of the work on voice assistants, especially with things like cultural bias in language, does sort of show that, like, in an effort to become like machine readable, like we transform ourselves to, to format the machine. And so whether that means, folks are code switching into, a kind of speech pattern that becomes legible. I have talked to users who have different dialects or are ESL users, and they're like, yeah, like my daughter and I like code switch because Alexa can't understand our accent. And so then we are like, okay, Alexa, how about this? And they're like, we don't talk like that, but that's how Alexa, and so even folks who aren't doing that are, like you're being trained to kind of format how you think and ask. And so there is sort of like an interesting interplay of like the way that to really like effectively use these machines, like we have to kind of adapt to become more machine-like, to get the most out of them. So anyway, just a thought that you made me think there. Okay, I love this question. So the question in the chat is, we've mostly discussed domestic female AI voice assistants. Do you know the opposite, such as virtual boyfriend, husband? So there's not so much of that, actually, right? So the gender specificity does, it has a foothold at like a number of cultural levels globally. So like, it's not an accident that these technologies were gendered female. That worked for a number of reasons, because in patriarchal societies, right, where women and the labor market is divided already, and we have images of sort of, these tropes like the secretary and things like that that are gendered, or service roles that kind of imply a particular power relationship. And in the home, with another space that is very much constructed around, gender division as well. So it's all very specific and historical. And so the other thing that happens in design is that because we have all these cultural expectations, then they become kind of re-encoded in design processes, like a kind of like design truth that you can't violate. So in the HCI literature, what you'll see is, people like interacting with feminized voice assistants more. They prefer it. So since they prefer it, we're going to keep designing it. Well, they prefer it because of these cultural messaging about these roles. So it's sexist, but it's preferred. So now it's a design truth. So it gets a real foothold. And then the virtual boyfriend husband. So there have been some, so I will talk about this in the book too, the kind of like diversifying movements around these technologies. Like suddenly the public is aware that this is all sexist and is like, oh my God, voice assistants are sexist, And it's like, well, yes, we've been knowing that, but like now we're talking about it more. And so companies are adapting to that in several ways. Some ways are to provide male voices that the consumer can choose, right? And be like, oh, well, it's a consumer choice model. Like let the market decide, right? if you are a gamer and if you're into gaming and stuff, you might realize that having options of avatar does not mean that, sexism got solved, or what have you, right? Or racism, right? That like we can still see how the market didn't solve that. So I don't know that that's quite the right answer. But there's also been some interesting ways, movements to re-envision this altogether. There's something called the Feminist AI Initiative, and they have they tried to embed in the code responses to kind of alert you to this gender, sort of the genderified scenarios that you're engaged in, so that the chatbot will sort of be like, no, that it responds in ways that kind of acknowledges the limitations of the framework. And then we also have projects that are trying to really kind of question gender altogether as a design feature for these things, like Project Q, which was this genderless voice technology. That one's like a whole other can of worms because of how they've designed it, but they initially used non-binary folks, and self-identified non-binary folks who participated, took their voices, and then they were like, we're gonna figure out how to make a non-binary voice. There's so many things in that, right? What does that mean? But they ended up just taking the spectrum of voice frequencies and just saying, let's just take the average of that, and then that'll be the voice. And so I have a whole other talk on that to go into, in the ways in which that kind of reinstates ideas of gender. But anyway, so your question, that was really interesting. And yeah, there's not a short answer, but thank you for the ask. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, that was a great question and response. Berlin says, thank you, great talk. And then Zeshwan followed up, thanks for a great answer. Yes, I'm actually doing game study. I agree it's actually a more or less global and historical issue. Do you happen to know AI voice assistant situation outside of the US? Do you consider voice is the same or even more valuable mode of, of information than visual, where we usually tend to not to share visual, but we kind of share voice much widely? Sorry if the latter question is kind of confusing. I'm interested in the effects of voice actors in gameplay.
Yeah, I'll respond quickly because I know we're at time. Those are really great questions that are deep. Do I know of voice assistant situations outside the US? Yes, often these are culturally situated. So when we were looking at the holographic airport workers, for instance, that kind of do similar things, then depending on their market, they were designed to look different and speak differently, right? So that that it was very much clear that they are being designed to speak to particular audiences. Some of the gender things are intact there, but I think that certainly they're being designed to culturally resonate, right, with wherever they're being used, sort of in a geopolitical sense. And then the second question about, do we think that voice is the same or more valuable? I don't know that there's one that's more valuable. I do think that people may not think that voice is as powerful a biometric as other biometrics, and not realize that people might be like, oh, I don't know if I want to give my fingerprint, but here's my voice, right? And it's kind of like, well, you can do a lot with voice, in terms of what it can be used as a predictor of. And so I think that that's something that folks maybe aren't as sensitized to. So